Here we are, just about to see some of the cars that I've only glimpsed actually in the flesh in this most extraordinary building, the Guggenheim in Bilbao, designed by Frank Gehry, much of it clad in titanium, which is something normally reserved for space rockets and so on. And it's as wondrous inside as it is out. So, straight into the main hall and the very granddaddy of them all, the Benz, which was 1886. And this was, state-of-the-art 1886. Very, very simple petrol engine at the rear, two large wheels, entirely chain-driven, and one single wheel the front steered with a tiller. Adequate for two people. I wouldn't feel very safe, I don't think, travelling in it. But then this one was driven, the original, in 1888, was driven 106 kilometres from Mannheim to Pforzheim and back. The first ever long-distance journey by automobile. That really sort of began it all. And then we take a leap into the 1930s with the Chrysler Airflow. I mean, it's a large American car, but it's aerodynamically far ahead of anything of its time, with a curving front grille, lamps built in. Everything about it is curvaceous, quite literally, and that's what was wanted at the time. That was a real forerunner. But interestingly, alongside it, the Tatra, and the Tatra was also a very adventurous car. This is the T87 from 1948. Tatra, well, it's okay. We probably regard it these days as rather old-fashioned. In its day, it certainly was not that. Built in Czechoslovakia, originally from the 1930s, but it's extraordinarily aerodynamic again, rear-engined with huge rear scoops and a fabulous rear tail. Huge venture. I mean, this is the sort of thing we're seeing in supercars today. Yeah, these two cars, or these three cars, have led to influential designs by so many of the current crop of car designers. They do all learn from each other, and they do all learn from the art and architecture of the time. An old favourite of mine, the Bugatti Racing Car, one of the most successful racing cars of its time. This is the T35 from 1924. Absolutely, Ettore Bugatti was a leading car designer of his day. The cars were lighter, stronger, faster, and just superior in every possible way, which is why they won so many races. And they're absolutely jewel-like in the precision with which they're put together, but they're particularly noticeable in the front end construction. But if you look inside, in the cockpit, that's the same. It's just everything is immaculate, everything is polished, because that was the way Ettore Bugatti was. And Bugatti still has that reputation for being absolutely precision engineering. Now, to something completely different, a sort of French grand routier of the period, 1920s. This is the Voisin C7. They have this really quite extraordinary motif on the front, massive saloon of its day, absolutely luxurious, driven probably by a chauffeur rather than the proud owner who would be counting their money in the back. But again, it's extraordinarily adventurous in its design. Now we have a car here that I do recognise. This is proudly from Bewley. And given the fact it's got GB plates on it, it looks like it may well have been driven here. This is the Rolls-Royce 4050, the Alpine Eagle of 1914, just the point at which Rolls-Royce was beginning to make itself known around the world as an incredible long-distance tourer. It could go anywhere, and did go anywhere and everywhere. Everything is perfected to be as durable as possible. Now, this is an old friend of many millions. This is the car that put America on the road, as they say, the Model T Ford. This is a 1914, so the first of these were 1908. Around about 1912, 1914, they were really selling in massive numbers. I have driven one. I found an early one very difficult to drive because the pedals don't work in the way that you expect. The pedals are reversed and you change gear with a pedal as well, including, if you're particularly unwary, changing into reverse. But, as we said, this put America on the road because it was so affordable. They made 15 million of them. Now this is certainly a car that I've never seen before, and I knew nothing of, and still know nothing of, so I'm going to have to read from this. This is a 1900, and it's an electric vehicle, yes. They were fashionable then too. At one time the land speed record was held by the Frenchman Camille Genazzi in his car, which was battery powered, and it was like an electric rocket almost. They made 305 of these, devised by Porsche. This was a sort of hybrid, primitive in its way, nevertheless a viable four-seater. Were on now somewhat different wheels and tyres, and it's much more road going, recognisably with a steering wheel, an accelerator pedal, and a front canopy that looks like it came out of a Batman film. Quite extraordinary. Or maybe influenced the Batman film. I did talk about them influencing each other. Ferdinand Porsche was just 24 when he designed this. The two front wheels have electric motors built in, and that's the sort of thing that's being done today. And the moon buggies are mostly powered in that very way. Okay, so we've come into the next gallery. Now this is a car, I don't think we've seen this one before, but I have seen one of these before. This is the Bugatti Type 57 Atlantic. Ettore Bugatti, we've already talked about how jewel-like these vehicles are. Every panel on it is pop riveted together, as you'll see, and it's airflowed together. It's extraordinarily detailed, with the aerodynamic ridge running through it. It's a very odd way of building the car, but it's one of the most aerodynamic cars of its age. I notice it's got trafficators, the old-fashioned pop-up trafficators. That must have been like putting the brakes on, but I mean this was a seriously expensive, seriously quick car in its day. I've talked before about my love of French Grand Routiers. This is the Delahaye Type 165. This is a 1939 car. One wonders, had war not intervened, what would have become of Delahaye, because they pretty much collapsed after the Second World War. But this was such an elegant car, beautifully curvaceous, picked out at its very best here under these lights. It's so polished, it's so aerodynamic. Wheel spats on all four wheels, and an absolute delight. I mean, it's going at 150 miles an hour even while it's parked with the handbrake on. It's just so fast. Beautiful headlights all chromed in, and that the Delahaye badge. I've seen a few of these before, but not this particular car. And we turn around behind to the Bentley R-Type Continental. This is a 1953. Bentley, of course, still using that naming. Say 52, they made 200 of these. The early 60s ones, I think, look slightly better, but nevertheless, it's a jewel of its day. Quite amazing. And then we come round to something I've never seen. This is very Spanish, very much of its time. It's absolutely bright yellow. This is a Pegaso, a Spanish make. They were very successful in making sports cars, briefly, and I think this was a more design exercise. This is the Z102 Cúpula, a little like the Ferrari bread van. It's got a massive sort of plexiglass dome at the rear. 1952, as I thought, it's a project car. There was only one made, beautifully spatted at the rear, and quite extraordinary how the front wings, reveal the wheel while hiding it, sort of partially hiding it aerodynamically. Absolutely beautiful. Well, our third gallery, totally different. Let's start with a minimalist car, entirely in plywood from 1936. This is a Le Corbusier, I referred to him earlier, most known as a futurist architect, but in this case an extraordinarily complex piece of woodwork. A project, no doubt, that he had hoped would turn itself into a car. Well, I guess it did, because it's certainly the forerunner of the 2CV. It looks very much like the 2CV, and Le Corbusier claimed that the 2CV idea was pinched from him. The original Fiat 500, still a pretty little car. This is a 57, the Nuova 500 d'Antedia Corsa. They made nearly 4 million of these, which is quite extraordinary. And the rather larger and rather less well-known 600 followed that. But this is BMW's take on it. This is the BMW 600 from 1957, designed by Willie Black. This is a front entry car. It must have been an interesting scramble to get into the back seats, but like the sort of Isetta of the period, entirely entered from the front. I've not seen one of these before. It's an interesting piece of design packaging to get everything in there, and everything is actually sort of connected to the front door, which is really quite bizarre. And then we come on to an old friend, because this has been seen in many places. This is a half Mini, so it's a 66 Mini, which has been more or less cut in half, which is a very good way of illustrating how it's put together. I never realised until this moment just how thin the Mini roof was. Oh, having rolled one many years ago, I suppose I should have known, but there you go. Interesting to see it cut. You get a better understanding, I think, of the packaging with it cut away like this, and with the way in which Alec Isigonis repackaged that entire front end of engine, transmission and everything else. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of packaging. Followed by the Molten bike. Much later, of course, 1998. Can't say that I'm much into bikes, but a very interesting space frame structure for it. Interesting way in which it's been done. Now this is an old friend. This is a Renault Four. I may have mentioned this before, but if you took one of these and made it 2 feet narrower and 2 feet longer and caged it and used a fiberglass body with a supercharged 350 cubic inch American V8, Chevy V8, this is what I was drag racing in the late 80s, I suppose, mid to late 80s, with a couple of colleagues. I think the car, when one of our 3 owners passed on, sadly, the car was then sold and I think finished up in Holland. But, we were running 12s and 13s in its day. Very utilitarian vehicle. I'd love to have one now, actually. Incredibly practical. On to a Splitty. Quite an early one. The experts would know the number of windows, because the number of windows is critical. This is the Samba from 62. I had 2 of the slightly later ones. Enjoyed them very much, although they were continually breaking down. And 2CV. This is the Sahara with it's a sort of ruggedized version. I don't think I'd be very comfortable with having fuel in the doors, but this did. They made nearly 700 of these. I'm quite amazed. With a bonnet with an inset spare, additional cooling, an exposed fan at the rear. There were all kinds of things done to justify this being called a Sahara. And then we come on to, really one of the granddaddies of them all. Volkswagen Classic. This is the Ubiquitous Beetle. It's a 51. It's actually the same age as me. It looks in better shape. Another Ferdinand Porsche, of course. They made 22 million of these. Those sorts of numbers illustrate just how popular motoring became. And now we come into, rather differently, the motorsport area. Now there's some old friends here. We come straight into a Gullwing, a Mercedes Gullwing, 250 GTO. I've seen this driven so many times by Nick, by Nettie, and it's a Bizzarini. This is Nick's 10/10ths company has lent this one. Beautifully presented. I've always been amazed at how tractable it actually is for what is a very limited number. I think it's 36 or 37 built. It's a race car, but I remember seeing him years ago driving this through Hammersmith through very slow traffic, and it seemed to be quite happy. So now we come to the famous James Bond cars. I think this is a 5. This is one of the early ones. Beautiful Frank Sayre design, the Jaguar E-Type. Now I think this is an early one. This is, I think, a 3.8. The 4.2, oh, it's a left-hand driver as well. The 4.2 had a little more grunt. I've driven both. Most delightful car to drive. The Porsche 356 right beside it. This is an early 1950 one. Again, this is Norman Foster's. Probably the area that I've been most interested in, which is the futurist cars. Now, this is a car I've never seen in the flesh. This is Buckminster Fuller, for those of you who are familiar with geodesic domes. Bucky Fuller was the inventor of the geodesic dome. He also invented lots of things, but he invented the Dymaxion car, which was, I'd say, I've never seen one in the flesh. But then we come on to some of the real futurist cars. This is the Alfa Romeo Bat 7. This is from 1954. This is slippery in the extreme. Called Bat. It was one of a series. And it was, well, take wind tunnel aerodynamics to their crazy extreme. This is it. This is an extraordinarily looking motor car built by Bertoni, I believe, actually put together, but it's an Alfa Romeo. And now, a Lancia Stratos Zero. Well, we talked about things being taken to their extreme. This certainly is. Another Bertoni, purely a styling exercise. Only one made. The rear engine cover, can't call it a bonnet, it isn't. Engine cover lifted up so that one can see. It's sort of mid-rear engined, but the cockpit is quite extraordinary. We come on to some amazing General Motors cars. The Firebird series. This is, well, if you let your top designers go lakes racing, go and get involved with Bonneville, speed weeks and so on and so on, you end up with a car that looks like this, because it's not a car, it's one person in an incredibly slippery vehicle. It's going to go very fast. And it's the jet age. It's a Harley Earl, one of his great designs, 1954, just the one. It's a show car, but it's illustrative of how far you can take these things. Oh, there's some interesting Americana in the next hall. The Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz from 59. We talked about the Harley Earl and the wings and fins. This has, well, it's the classic wings and fins American auto. I mean, they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. But at the other extreme is absolutely delightful Lakes Racer, the Ford Pearson Brothers Coupe from 34. Well, I don't think it is from 34. It was based upon a 34 Model B, I would think, but they built it in 1950. It's incredibly low, incredibly cut down, and it's basically a Lakes Racer, no fenders to get in the way. Beautifully presented, very quick car in its day, and one of the classic American cars, the Mustang. They tell me that the perfect Mustang is the 64.5. Well, this is a 65. They made 10.25 million of these. This is from Haynes Motor Museum. And then at the other end of the Americana is the ubiquitous Willys Jeep, which This is a very late one, so this is 45. Much of these were made by Ford, in fact, rather than Willys, because they couldn't keep up with demand from the American forces. This one is a very, very nice one. There were nearly 400,000 of these made. I'm not sure how many still survive now, but it's the classic army Jeep. It's got axe and shovel on the side. It's got fuel tanks on the back, spare wheels, and they were just so tough. They could go through, over and under just about anything. Quite complex transfer box, so you had four-wheel drive available at any time you wanted it. This is their Sound of Motion gallery. So with that soundtrack to end on, this was something special for me, because this was an opportunity to see lots of cars I'd never seen in the flesh, I'd never seen in reality. This has been a quite extraordinary day out in one of the most extraordinary museums in Europe, if not the world, Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum